From New York, this is Democracy Now!
Israel needs a strong government, stable government, Zionist government, a government that is committed to Israel as a national state for the Jewish people. There can't be a government that is being supported by Arab parties which are anti-Zionist.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's political future is in question, as Tuesday's Israeli election remains too close to call. Neither Netanyahu nor his rival, the former Israeli Army Chief Benny Gantz, secured a majority of seats in the Knesset, will go to Jerusalem for the latest. Then striking GM workers have entered their third day on the picket line.
I want to be clear about something. This strike is about us. It is about standing up for fair wages, for affordable quality health care, for our share of profits, and for our job security.
We'll speak to longtime labor reporter Stephen Greenhouse, author of the new book, Beaten Down, Worked Up, The Past, Present, and Future of American Labor. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Israel is facing political turmoil as Tuesday's election remains too close to call, with 92% of the vote counted. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party and ex-military chief Benny Gantz's Blue and White party appear to be nearly tied with about 32 seats in the Knesset. The election was called after Netanyahu failed to build a coalition government following an April election. It also came as Netanyahu is facing possible indictments over multiple corruption cases. He promised to annex nearly a third of the occupied West Bank in violation of international law if elected. Earlier this year, Gantz threatened to bomb Gaza back to the Stone Ages. We'll have the latest on the Israeli election after headlines. In climate news, a new study warns the global average temperature could rise by as much as 7 degrees Celsius, or 12.5 degrees Fahrenheit, above pre-industrial levels by the end of the century, unless nations move rapidly to slash greenhouse gas emissions. The stark warning comes as world leaders are preparing to gather at the United Nations headquarters in New York on Monday for the Climate Action Summit. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said Tuesday the world is losing the race to avert catastrophe.
July was the hottest month ever. These 5 years will be the hottest 5 years in record. We see the rising level of the ocean taking place, the highest concentrations ever of CO2 in the atmosphere. We need to go back 3 to 5 million years to get the same levels of CO2. And at that time, water level was 10 to 20 meters higher than what it is today. So we are really dealing with a very dramatic threat, not only to the future of the planet, but to the planet today.
In Washington, D.C., youth climate leaders called out lawmakers Tuesday for failing to act urgently to prevent a climate catastrophe. 16-year-old Swedish climate activist, school strike leader Greta Thunberg, who was invited by Democrats to a meeting of the Senate Climate Crisis Task Force, told the gathering, quote, "Don't invite us here to tell us how inspiring we are without doing anything about it." She added, "I know you're trying, but just not hard enough. Sorry," she said. Her challenge came as youth climate leaders visited Capitol Hill to support the Green New Deal resolution co-sponsored by Massachusetts Senator Ed Markey and Congressmember Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York. The Swedish climate activist also met with former President Obama. 15-year-old Callan Benson of Maryland called on students and workers to join a massive series of climate strikes planned for Friday.
And you have to be involved. And that means you adults as well. You are the ones currently in power. We don't have time to wait till my generation takes over. It's you that have to act. We need you to listen to the scientists that are showing us that climate change is here and climate change is human-caused. Stop burning fossil fuels, please, for my generation.
Organizers predict Friday's global climate strike will be some of the largest climate protests in U.S. history, with actions planned in over 800 sites in all 50 states. More actions are planned worldwide. In Texas, Tropical Depression Imelda made landfall south of Houston Tuesday, bringing flash floods of up to 18 inches of rain forecast for parts of the region. It's the region's worst rainstorm since Hurricane Harvey dumped an estimated 33 trillion gallons of water on Texas 2 years ago, with up to 52 inches of rain in parts of the Gulf Coast, the most rain ever recorded in a U.S. storm. Meanwhile, over the Atlantic Ocean, Hurricane Humberto has strengthened to a strong Category 3 storm, with officials in Bermuda issuing warnings ahead of its expected arrival Wednesday night. The Trump administration is preparing to revoke California's air pollution standards for cars and light trucks in its latest regulatory rollback of laws aimed at slowing the climate crisis. The move, which is expected to be announced this week, seeks to cancel California's agreement with Ford, Honda, Volkswagen, and BMW that would see passenger vehicles average about 50 miles per gallon by 2026. The Trump administration's proposed freezing auto efficiency at 2020 levels, or around 37 miles a gallon. 13 states and Washington, D.C. have promised to adopt California's more stringent air quality rules, and California lawmakers have promised to challenge the rollback in court. This comes as President Trump is traveling to California today for fundraisers in Silicon Valley and Los Angeles. On Capitol Hill, President Trump's former campaign manager, Corey Lewandowski, stonewalled and frustrated Congress members for 6 hours Tuesday as the House Judiciary Committee held the first official hearing of its presidential impeachment investigation. During the hearing, Lewandowski admitted President Trump asked him in June 2017 to pressure then Attorney General Jeff Sessions to rein in special counsel Robert Mueller's investigation. That directly contradicts Lewandowski's public statements on television earlier this year. Consulting attorney Barry Burke, hired by Democrats to cross-examine Trump's ex-campaign manager, played a clip of Lewandowski on MSNBC last May.
Did you hear that, sir? That was you saying on MSNBC, you don't ever remember the president ever asking you to get involved with Jeff Sessions or the Department of Justice in any way, shape, or form. That wasn't true, was it, sir?
I heard that.
And that was not true, was it?
I have no obligation to be honest with the media because they're just as dishonest as anybody else.
So you're admitting, sir, you were not being truthful in that clip, correct?
My interview with Ari Melberg?
Yes.
Can be interpreted any way you'd like.
House Judiciary Committee Chair Gerald Nadler said he may seek to hold Lewandowski in contempt of Congress over his refusal to answer the committee's questions. Ahead of the hearing, Lewandowski used the Twitter hashtag Senate2020 to hint that he'll seek the Republican nomination to challenge New Hampshire Democrat Jeanne Shaheen next year. He later tweeted out a formal announcement of candidacy after asking for a 5-minute recess. In New Mexico, President Trump falsely declared at a campaign rally Monday that Latinos support his border wall, proclaiming, quote, "We love our Hispanics." During the rally in Rio Rancho, Trump pointed to Steve Cortes, a former paid on-air contributor at CNN and member of Trump's 2020 campaign committee.
He happens to be Hispanic. He happens to be Hispanic, but I've never quite figured it out because he looks more like a wasp than I do. Nobody loves the Hispanics more. Who do you like more, the country or the Hispanics? He says the country. I don't know. I may have to go for the Hispanics, to be honest with you. We got a lot of Hispanics. We love our Hispanics.
In response, the progressive political group Latino Victory tweeted, "This is racist, this is xenophobic, this is the type of rhetoric that led to the biggest anti-Latino massacre in modern history," unquote. A reference to last month's mass shooting at a Walmart in El Paso, Texas, where a white supremacist with an assault rifle killed 22 people and wounded 24 others. The killer published a hate-filled manifesto that echoed President Trump's language on migrants from Latin America. Human Rights Watch is calling on China's government to immediately stop separating Uyghur children from their families in the western province of Xinjiang. Human Rights Watch says countless children have been jailed in state-run child welfare institutions and boarding schools without parental consent or access as part of a program that's seen an estimated 1 million Uyghur adults imprisoned in camps that China claims are vocational training centers designed to combat extremism. Last week, the Senate passed the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, calling for the U.S. to consider human rights sanctions against Chinese officials. House lawmakers have yet to vote on a companion bill. This comes as a new report finds at least 75 countries around the world are using facial recognition and other forms of artificial intelligence to surveil massive numbers of people. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace warns new technologies like automated border controls and algorithmic tools are being rapidly developed by companies in China, France, Germany, Israel, Japan, and the United States. The Trump administration filed suit Tuesday against NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden over his newly released memoir titled Permanent Record, seeking to block his publisher from forwarding any revenue from book sales. Snowden tweeted in response, quote, "This is the book the government does not want you to read," unquote. This comes after Snowden, who's been in exile in Russia since 2013, told CBS News Monday he would return to the U.S. if he was guaranteed a fair trial and a chance to share with the American public why he leaked NSA documents.
I'm not asking for a pardon. I'm not asking for a pass. What I'm asking for is a fair trial. And this is the bottom line that any American should require, right? We don't want people thrown in prison without the jury being able to decide whether what they did was right or wrong.
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo travels to Saudi Arabia today for talks with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman after weekend drone attacks on major oil facilities in Saudi Arabia. The Trump administration's directly blamed Iran for the attack, which was claimed by Houthi rebels in Yemen. This comes as Energy Secretary Rick Perry confirmed reports the U.S. is negotiating with Saudi Arabia over its plan to build nuclear reactors. The Trump administration's reportedly been pursuing a deal to share U.S. nuclear technology with Saudi Arabia as the Saudis prepare to build at least 2 nuclear power plants. Back in the United States, an African-American trans woman who was murdered in Kansas City, Kansas last Friday has been identified as Jaliyah Jamar. She's at least the 19th transgender person to be murdered in the U.S. this year. 13 died from gun violence, and the majority are women of color. Jaliyah Jamar's killing follows the murder of 32-year-old Brooklyn Lindsay in Kansas City, Missouri in June. Meanwhile, in Portland, Oregon, police are investigating last week's assault of a transgender woman named Atlas Marshall as a possible hate crime. Marshall was attacked by a man shouting homophobic and transphobic slurs, leaving her with bruises on her head and knees. General Motors has cut off health insurance for the nearly 50,000 people on picket lines across the country demanding better working conditions and fair pay. The news came Tuesday, just one day after UAW members kicked off the strike by walking out of more than 50 GM facilities. We'll have more on the GM strike later with longtime labor reporter Stephen Greenhouse. In more labor news, Whole Foods is cutting medical benefits for about 1,900 of its part-time workers, this according to a report by Business Insider. Whole Foods is owned by Amazon, whose CEO Jeff Bezos is the richest man in the world, with an estimated net worth of over $114 billion. A new analysis by the consumer watchdog Decision Data finds, quote, Bezos makes more money than the cost of an entire year of benefits for these 1,900 employees in somewhere between 2 to 6 hours. Here in New York, hundreds of Uber and Lyft drivers joined a slow vehicle procession across the Brooklyn Bridge Tuesday morning, snarling rush-hour traffic to protest changes to the ride-hailing services they say will cheat them out of city pay regulations. The drivers took their protest procession up Manhattan's East Side to Gracie Mansion, the home of New York City's mayor, 2020 presidential hopeful Bill de Blasio, calling on him to intervene. And veteran broadcast journalist Cokie Roberts died Tuesday in Washington, D.C. of complications from breast cancer. She was 75 years old. Cokie Roberts was known for her pioneering work as a high-profile woman in broadcasting at a time when the field was dominated by men. She began her broadcast career with National Public Radio in the late 70s, joining ABC News in 1988. In 2001, the media watchdog group Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting criticized Cokie Roberts' reporting awarding her a so-called Pulitzer Prize. Speaking on the David Letterman show in 2001, she said, quote, I will just confess to you, a total sucker for the guys who stand up with all the ribbons on and stuff. And if they say it's true, and I'm ready to believe it. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world. Israel is facing more political turmoil as its national elections Tuesday remain too close to call. With 92% of the vote counted, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party and ex-military chief Benny Gantz's Blue and White party appear to be nearly tied with about 32 seats in the Knesset. Netanyahu was seeking a record fifth term as prime minister, but his political future is now in question. The election was called after Netanyahu failed to build a coalition government following an election in April. It also came as Netanyahu is facing possible indictments over multiple corruption cases.
Both Netanyahu and Gantz had run on platforms vowing to take harsh measures targeting Palestinians. Netanyahu promised to annex nearly a third of the occupied West Bank if he won, in violation of international law. Earlier this year, Gantz bragged in a campaign ad he'd bombed Gaza back to the Stone Ages, and he vowed to, quote, pound Gaza again. As chief of staff of the Israel Defense Forces, Gantz oversaw Israel's assaults on Gaza in 2012 and 2014. He's currently facing a war crimes lawsuit in a Dutch court filed by a Dutch Palestinian woman who lost 6 relatives in Israel's 2014 assault on Gaza. On Tuesday night, Gantz said he had fulfilled his mission by preventing Netanyahu's outright re-election.
I am happy and very excited to be here tonight. We will, of course, await the actual results, but as it seems, we fulfilled our mission, and just as important, we fulfilled it our way. One can say that according to the results as they appear to be, Netanyahu did not succeed in his mission.
Meanwhile, on Tuesday night, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu did not claim victory or concede defeat in a speech to his supporters.
Israel needs a strong government. Stable government, Zionist government, a government that is committed to Israel as a national state for the Jewish people. There can't be a government that is being supported by Arab parties which are anti-Zionist.
The close election could result in the far-right former defense minister, Victor Lieberman, becoming the kingmaker as both Gantz and Lieberman attempt to form a coalition government, as both Gantz and Netanyahu attempt to form a coalition government. We go now to Jerusalem, where we're joined by the Palestinian attorney, Diana Buttu. She's a former advisor to Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, serves as policy advisor of Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. Her latest piece for The Nation is headlined, "The Israeli Elections are a referendum on who can treat Palestinians most harshly." Diana Buttu, welcome to Democracy Now! Your take on the elections so far.
Well, so far it's not clear. It's not clear who will be the ultimate victor. I can tell you who will be the ultimate loser, and that's the Palestinian people. This is because both Netanyahu and Gantz have come out very strongly against Palestinians. This was not, for example, a referendum on the more than 50-year military occupation, but instead it was a campaign that was filled with racist statements on the part of Netanyahu, urging people to vote because the Arabs were voting out in large numbers, and with Gantz also saying that he was intending to crush Gaza. So we don't know yet who the victor will be, but we certainly do know who the loser will be, and that will be those who don't want to see apartheid, those who don't want to see a continuation of the occupation, and those who do want to see freedom.
And Diana Buttu, you've mentioned, for instance, that there was no discussion in this campaign of the Jewish nation-state law that was passed the last year and which really calls deeply into question any Israeli claims to being a democratic state. Could you talk about that?
Yes, certainly. In fact, none of the party platforms, with the exception of the one anti-Zionist group called the Joint List, none of them even mentioned words like occupation or had a platform when it came to Palestinian freedom or even mentioned the word equality. Instead, all of the political parties across the spectrum, with the exception of the Joint List, really came out and said that this needs to be a Jewish state. They need to preserve the idea of a Jewish majority and Jewish superiority, and none of them really had anything to say about Palestinian freedom. So in sum total, when we were looking at this election as a Palestinian who's a citizen of Israel, this really was an election in U.S. terms of between Trump versus Trump, with no real difference between the candidates and certainly no difference between the political parties and platforms.
And what about the Joint List? Did it grow in numbers based on the results so far?
Yes. What we did see was that the Joint List ran a very strong campaign, a campaign that was aimed at stopping the extreme right-wing fascist party, a party that is labeled as a terrorist party in the United States. The attempt was to try to get as many people out to vote so that this party would be stopped, and indeed they did succeed in that. Not only succeeded, but they've increased their numbers to yet another seat. What was very interesting in their campaign was that the campaign is not just a campaign that targets Arab voters. It's a campaign that targets the Jewish Israeli left and says to the Jewish Israeli left, if you really believe in an end to the occupation, if you really believe in equality, ours is the only party that has that platform. And we did see that they managed to secure votes from Jewish Israeli voters as well, because of the fact that there is really no alternative. All of the other parties were competing over how harsh they could be against Palestinians, not in terms of what vision they have for freedom or equality.
I'd like to turn to the Democratic Union Knesset candidate Stav Shafir. She was first elected to the Knesset as a member of the Labor Party in 2013, becoming the youngest woman lawmaker in Israeli history. She told CNN Tuesday the majority of Israelis support a two-state solution. This is what she said.
Most Israeli citizens are not like Netanyahu. We have, even after 40 years of mostly right-wing governments, we have 65% of Israelis who support a two-state solution between Israel and the Palestinians. That's the most safe solution. It's the most moral solution that we all support. But Netanyahu at the moment, regardless of what he actually believes and of what our security system supports, the entire Israeli security system is pro-two-state solution and a clear border between us and the Palestinians. Netanyahu at the moment will do everything that he can in order to build a government and escape trial, to pass legislation that will prevent the justice system and prevent Parliament from putting him in trial and from getting into prison because of his corruption cases.
Diana Boutou, your response and the significance of Stav Shafir.
It's very interesting that she says this, given that her own party platform didn't mention ending the occupation, didn't at all talk about the two-state solution, and she was aligned with Ehud Barak, who's also a member of her political party. This is the former Israeli prime minister who propagated the false claim that there was no Palestinian peace partner, and who himself was the person who was responsible for killing 13 Palestinian citizens of Israel in October of 2000 when the Second Intifada started. So it's wonderful that she has this outlook at this point in time when the election is done, but it would have been obviously much better for her to have had this outcome, this vision from the beginning, articulated that vision in the beginning, and been pushing for Netanyahu and other parties to actually end the occupation rather than continuing to perpetuate it.
And I want to ask you about Netanyahu's pledge earlier this month to annex a third of the West Bank if re-elected. Despite the widespread condemnation his proposal received, his main political rival, Benny Gantz, offered no criticism, instead claimed Netanyahu took the idea from him. Gantz's blue and white coalition said the Jordan Valley is, quote, a part of Israel forever. Netanyahu drafted a plan to cede the Jordan Valley in 2014. We're happy Netanyahu has come around to adopt the blue and white plan to recognize the Jordan Valley, he said. This is Netanyahu announcing his pledge to annex a third of the West Bank last week.
Today I'm announcing my intention to apply with the formation of the next government, Israeli sovereignty on the Jordan Valley and northern Dead Sea.
Anna Butu, what would this mean? And does it matter if either Gantz or Netanyahu is prime minister, given each is claiming it's his own idea?
You know, the fascinating thing is that it's been condemned by the entire world, but it's been applauded inside Israel. So it shows you exactly where the Israeli public lies. When you see Netanyahu bragging about this plan and other parties also coming forward and bragging about it, and the so-called centrist Gantz coming forward and not just bragging about it, but claiming that it's his own, you can see exactly where the thinking lies inside Israel, that they believe that they are above the law. They believe that the Palestinians are beneath the law and that they can do whatever they want. And this is why it is vitally important for us to keep our eyes on the fact that whether it is Gantz that's going to be in office or Netanyahu that's going to be in office, for Palestinians, the outcome is going to be the same. And this is also why it's very important for the BDS, the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Movement, to become even stronger, because that is the only way that Israel is going to be stopped.
Well, on Tuesday, Israel's far-right former defense minister Avigdor Lieberman called for a national unity government, as you mentioned, to be formed. This is what he said.
We have only one option, a national, liberal, broad government compromising Israel Baitenu, Likud, and Blue and White. Both financially and in terms of security, we are indeed in a state of crisis. Therefore, the country requires a broad government.
Diana Butu, your response about this national unity government and what it might mean.
This is something, you know, Lieberman was on the brink of extinction in terms of his political position. And even now, he's only the fifth in terms of the size of the party. But because of the fact that he and the other parties have this very racist outlook, he's now become somebody who is very important. So he doesn't want to see a redo of the election again, but is instead calling for a broad national unity coalition. National unity, in their terms, means anybody but Palestinians. Because they want to continue the settlement expansion, they want to continue annexation and so on. So even though Avigdor Lieberman is really not very important, because the fact that nobody really wants to look at the anti-Zionist party and their platform, they are instead pushing for to have this broad coalition that will continue to build and expand settlements and continue to deny Palestinians their freedom.
Arakat tweeted yesterday, quote, "The fact that about 5 million Palestinians will be governed by the Israeli Knesset cannot vote in today's election should tell you all you need to know about Israel and the international community's normalization of its racist system. Hashtag apartheid, hashtag settler colonialism." Again, that was a tweet from human rights attorney Noura Erakat. Diana Butu. Explain how the system works.
Yes, she's absolutely right. Well, the system works which is that only those people who are citizens of the State of Israel who are over the age of 18 are allowed to vote. Now, even though there are nearly 6 million individuals who are entitled to vote, Israel's also occupying land, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, where under the rules of occupation, these are individuals who are not entitled to vote and yet who are ruled over by Israel. And so the fact that you have this dual system in place where Israel's in control of the lives of millions of people, and half of those people are not entitled to vote, clearly shows the level of apartheid in the system that we have in place. And that is one of settler colonialism. It's one of apartheid. And this is why I think it's very important for us to recognize that rather than applauding somebody like Gantz, who may just be Israel's prime minister, we should instead be pushing and focusing on ending that apartheid system and making sure that Palestinians finally get to live in freedom and in dignity and in equality, rather than under a system of Israel's thumb. What was interesting yesterday was that as Israelis were going to the polls, the checkpoints were completely shut down, so that while Israelis had freedom of movement, Palestinians were locked in their Bantustans in order to be able to make sure that Israel was able to vote. This is the essence of living under apartheid and a settler colonial regime.
Diana Buttu, we want to thank you very much for being with us. Palestinian attorney, policy advisor of Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. Her latest piece for The Nation we'll link to. It's headlined, "The Israeli Elections Are a Referendum on Who Can Treat Palestinians Most Harshly." Previously, Diana Buttu was advisor to Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. When we come back, it's day 3 for the GM strike. Striking workers have entered that third day on the picket line, and now GM says they are cutting off their health insurance. We'll speak with veteran labor reporter Stephen Greenhouse. Stay with us.
Come all of you good miners, good news to you I'll tell of how the good old Union has come in here to dwell. Which side are you on? Which side are you on? My daddy was a miner, and I'm a miner's son, and I'll stick with the Union till every battle's won. Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Don't scab for the bosses, don't listen to their lies. Us poor folks haven't got a chance unless we organize. Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Which Side Are You On? By John Cohen, the acclaimed folk musician, photographer, filmmaker, and musicologist. He died Monday at the age of 87. He was a founding member of the New Lost City Ramblers. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, as members of the United Auto Workers head into their third day of a nationwide strike, General Motors has cut off health insurance for the nearly 50,000 people on picket lines across the country who are demanding better working conditions and fair pay. The news came Tuesday, just one day after UAW members kicked off the strike by walking out of more than 50 GM facilities. The workers say GM continues to deny employees' demands for better conditions and compensation, despite leading the company to record profits following bankruptcy and a federal bailout. GM responded by transferring the striking workers' health care costs to the union. UAW had sought to have GM cover striking health insurance through the end of the month. This is GM worker Steve Goralski in Bowling Green, Kentucky.
We got a company that had $35 billion in profits in the last few years. We've got temporaries that have been here over 7 years and are still temporaries, and they're asking for more temporaries. They're moving our plants out of country. They're taking them to Mexico and to China. And now they're asking for concessions on our health care. I don't know about you, but that's the reason I took this job. I used to have my own drywall company. I took it for the benefits.
Politico reported Tuesday that 2 top Trump administration officials were involved in ongoing labor negotiations and likely to side with the UAW. But GM and a White House spokesperson later denied the report. This is President Trump speaking about the striking workers Monday.
Well, I have a great relationship with the auto workers. I got tremendous numbers of votes from the auto workers. I don't want General Motors to be building plants outside of this country. As you know, they built many plants in China and Mexico, and I don't like that at all. My relationship has been very powerful with the auto workers, not necessarily the top person or two, but the people that work doing automobiles. Nobody's ever brought more companies into the United States.
It's the first company-wide strike against GM in 12 years. In 2007, GM workers walked out for 2 days. Well, for more, we're joined here in New York City by Stephen Greenhouse, veteran labor reporter, formerly with the New York Times. His new book is just out. It's called Beaten Down, Worked Up, The Past, Present, and Future of American Labor. He's also the author of The Big Squeeze, Tough Times for the American Worker. His recent op-ed in the New York Times headlined, "The auto workers' strike is bigger than GM." Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Steve.
Great to be here.
It's great to have you with us. So before we get into the history of the labor movement, which is really what your book is about, well, this is certainly one of the culminations of it, what we're seeing today. Talk about what's happening with UAW, what's happening with the workers, why they went out on strike against GM, and what this means.
So the UAW made big concessions back in 2008, 2009, 2010 when GM went bankrupt, and the union understandably wanted to help lift it out of bankruptcy to save jobs, so they agreed to wage freezes and a two-tier wage structure. And GM has since become quite profitable. And GM is not offering a very generous contract, just a 4% raise over 4 years, according to the Detroit Free Press. And it's moved a lot of factories to Mexico and China. And the workers are saying, you know, what gives? We, the workers, we, the U.S. taxpayers, save GM. So why is it closing, you know, important plants in the U.S. like the Lordstown plant, while, you know, keeping plants running in Mexico that make the same thing? So they just, I think it's basically a sense of we helped you, we went the extra mile for you, GM, and now we want you to be fair to us. It's really a strike over fairness and being treated with the respect they feel that they deserve.
And when you mentioned the concessions they made back in 2009-10 about this two-tier wage system, you actually explained last night in a forum that we were at that it's actually 3 tiers.
Yes.
What specifically does that mean, these tiers of wage systems?
So back in 2009, during the bankruptcy, GM told the United Auto Workers, we're definitely going to close these plants, and these other plants will agree to open, but only if we get a 2-tier wage system. So the top tier paid $29 an hour. They set up a bottom tier that ran from like $17 up to about $25. And then now there's this third tier, you know, temps, and the temps make $15 an hour, and some of the temps have been there 3 and 5 years. So with all this concern about the increased precariousness of the economy and increased instability in jobs, you know, one of the focuses of the union of the strikers is we got to get rid of these temp. I mean, we have to change these temp workers to make them permanent. It's unfair they're making just $15 an hour. They work side by side with people who make twice as much, and there's a feeling
side by side, often doing the same job.
Yeah,
right?
doing the same job, and it's part of the UAW's saying, you know, we've been good to you, GM. We want you to be fair and good to us. Plus, the workers in the second tier want the gap closed with the top tier. They want to be moved up to $29, $31 very, very quickly.
And this is Ted Crum, head of the UAW's bargaining committee, speaking at a news conference Sunday night.
I want to be clear about something. This strike is about us. It is about standing up for fair wages, for affordable quality health care, for our share of profits, and for our job security. We are standing with our brothers and sisters who are temporary employees and in-progression employees who do the same work we do for less pay. We are united. We are strong. We are ready. We don't take this lightly. But General Motors needs to understand that we stood up for GM when they needed us. These are profitable times. We work hard to make this company profitable, and we deserve a fair contract because we've helped make this company what it is. We're standing up for us. We make no mistake. The strike is about the members in Texas, Missouri, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, and throughout the great nation. We're fighting for the future of the middle class, and we want a fair and equitable contract. Thank you.
So that's Ted Crum, head of the UAW's bargaining committee, speaking at a news conference as they were going out on strike. If you could respond to what he says, and also this latest move by GM not to pay the health care of workers. You retweeted today Sarah Nelson, the president of the Association of Flight Attendants, CWA, tweeting about GM's decision to pull health care for all benefits. She said, "A note to anyone who wants to use union members as a wedge to oppose Medicare for all. UAW has one of the best plans in the country, but management can still use it to hold workers hostage. M4A puts power back in our hands," meaning Medicare for all.
So I wrote this book explaining that, you know, unions did an amazing job, you know, lifting workers, you know, last century, creating the middle class, creating the 40-hour week, making mines and factories much safer. But over the past 20, 30 years,
unions and worker power in the United States have gotten much, much weaker. I explained that's because, corporations have really played super hardball to weaken unions. Globalization has weakened unions, and we've seen the Republicans, Scott Walker most notably, trying extremely hard to weaken unions, especially public sector unions. So we're at a point where worker power in the United States is, I argue, the weakest it's been in many, many decades. So there's a sense now that something is really broken. I mean, something is really broken. And corporate profits have been at record levels and the stock market's at record levels, but we keep hearing that wages have been stagnant for year after year. They're going up a tiny bit now, but for the past few decades, they've been really stagnant for most workers. And people say, we have to fix this. And I think the reason we had the teacher strikes last year and the Marriott strike and the Stop and Shop strike and now the GM strike is they're saying, we're not getting our fair share. And as we just saw in the video clip, GM had $8.1 billion in profits last year. Over the past 3 years, it's had $35 billion in profits just from North America alone. And the workers are saying, but you're closing these plants when we helped you keep them open. You're offering us just a 4% raise over 4 years, just 1%, that this is wrong. So this, I believe, is part of this healthy burst of strikes where workers are trying to win back their fair share and flex their muscles.
Well, Steve, in your book, you talk about, obviously, the corporate assault and the inability of unions to organize based on how the labor laws are being implemented by government. But you also talk about the self-inflicted wounds of the labor movement. And you talk about corruption that existed for many years in many labor unions. We're seeing that now with some investigations of the UAW, the sexism and racism of the union movement itself that didn't allow women workers and African Americans to either to get into unions or then to be able to get into leadership. But I'm wondering, you also touch on this whole question of the failure of the labor movement to deal with the changing nature of work and technology. One of the most fascinating things in your book, you talk about companies like TaskRabbit and Mechanical Turk and how workers are being forced to organize in those areas. Talk about, most people don't even know what these things are.
That's a lot of ground to cover. So, I make clear in the book that on one hand, some unions very much discriminated against women, workers of color, African Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanics. But I also make clear that, going back over a century, women were an incredibly important part of the labor movement. Mother Jones, I write about this amazing strike in New York in 1909, 20,000 female garment workers, most of them immigrants. A lot of workers take for granted the 40-hour week. And I explain these people, went on strike for 2 months in the dead of winter just to win a 52-hour work week. And I make clear that, I have a chapter on the Memphis sanitation workers strike, and other unions backed them very strongly as they fought for both labor rights and respect on the job and civil rights. But as you say, Juan, there has been too much discrimination, too much corruption. The UAW, unfortunately, has had a corruption scandal that is tarring it right now, and that's hurting its image as it launches this big strike. I often, when I was covering labor for the New York Times for 19 years, people would often say to me, "Oh, unions are so corrupt," and I'd say, I don't know if unions are any more corrupt, pound for pound, person per person, than business is. Look at Purdue Pharma and opiates. Look at the Trump administration and how corrupt that is. I don't think unions are any more corrupt, and I think
look at the president.
In the 1950s and 1960s, the age of, the bad days of the Teamsters and the longshoremen and on the waterfront, there was horrendous corruption, and the unions are much, much cleaner now. There's much less corruption, but there's still, one bit of corruption is still too much.
Before we move on to...
What I wanted to ask you about this TaskRabbit and Mechanical Turk, if you could talk about them.
So in the book, I explain, 50 different ways that corporate America is trying to squeeze workers and weaken unions. It's using more temps. It's contracting out more. Now, the latest thing is using apps to turn, more and more workers into here today, gone tomorrow, here this minute, gone next minute workers, so they don't have to, they owe very little loyalty or responsibility to these workers. It says, and this is the big fight now with Uber and Lyft, it says, the companies are saying, you're not employees, you're just independent contractors. And if they're employees, then the workers can unionize. If they're employees, the companies have to pay part of the Social Security and Medicare taxes. If they're employees, then they're covered by anti-discrimination laws, anti-sexual harassment laws. So the companies really want to put millions and millions of workers into this independent contractor box. And they love this idea of like using apps so we can get a worker to work for 15 minutes and then dump him or her. It's like ideal. There's no responsibility to the worker. They're here, they're gone, they're not covered by minimum wage or overtime laws. And one of the big challenges for the labor movement and for all worker advocates, as I explain in my book, is like figuring out a way to lift these workers to, so that they could, improve their wages. There are all these Uber and Lyft drivers who work 60, 70 hours a week. They're busting their humps to try to support their families. They're not getting, health benefits from their jobs. And, there's this breakthrough in California. The state legislature passed a bill that would declare Uber and Lyft drivers employees rather than independent contractors. So that would give them overtime and minimum wage coverage. It would have the companies contribute to their Social Security and Medicare. It would, give them protections against race and sex discrimination. Now, the companies say, this is going to cost us too much. This is going to hurt our business model. We're going to have to hire fewer drivers. This is going to be worse for consumers. You might have to wait 6 minutes rather than 4 minutes for someone to pick you up.
And you mentioned there's 500,000 people working for Uber right now?
In the U.S., there's more than 500,000, and worldwide there are over 1 million. And this fight is playing out in England and France and Germany, too.
And you have Whole Foods cutting the medical benefits of 1,900 workers. And we said in headlines, Jeff Bezos owns Whole Foods because Amazon owns Whole Foods. Bezos makes more money than the cost of the entire year of benefits for these nearly 2,000 employees in something like 2 to 6 hours he makes.
Sometimes you wonder who does public relations for these people. Like, this is a real, black eye for Bezos. He's so rich, and he's really sticking it to these 2,000 workers, part-time workers, who I'm sure many of whom are having a hard time making ends meet.
We're going to break, and then we're going to come back. Stephen Greenhouse, longtime journalist, author of the new book, Beaten Down, Worked Up, The Past, Present, and Future of American Labor. Stay with us.
Yes, those rolling mills are burning down, plumb down. Yes, the rolling mills are burning down. Oh, the rolling mills are burning down, plumb down to the ground. They'll never build them back anymore. Oh, my darling, round here, for I don't want to hear you cry. The best of friends will fall out and fight, and why not you and I? Oh, those rolling mills are burning down, plumb down. Oh, the rolling mills are burning down.
Rolling Mills Burning Down by the folk musician John Cohen, who died on Monday at the age of 87. This is Democracy Now!, DemocracyNow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Our guest is Stephen Greenhouse, a former New York Times journalist. He is now author of the new book, Beaten Down, Worked Up, The Past, Present, and Future of American Labor. Among other things, we've been talking about this UAW strike, first major UAW strike in 12 years at GM. Interestingly, the Sunrise Movement, well known for pushing the Green New Deal, sitting down at Nancy Pelosi's office right before she was named House Speaker again. Varshini Prakash, the executive director of the Sunrise Movement, threw her support behind the strike, tweeting, "All workers deserve a right to fair wages, guaranteed health care, job security, and basic dignity." Talk about the Green New Deal and what this means for jobs today, and how companies like GM are adapting, and how environmentalists are working with unions now.
I think the Green New Deal is a great idea. I do think we face a real global warming crisis. I think we as a nation, our leadership is going in the very wrong direction. And when the Green New Deal was first announced, was leaked out prematurely before some details are worked out, a lot of union folks got angry and uneasy because they worry that coal mines and coal-fired power plants and gas-fired power plants would be closing very quickly and throw many, many people out of work. And I think the plan was released before they had finished working through, and the phrase now is ensuring a just transition. And union leaders are increasingly working with environmentalists to figure out what this just transition would be. You know, Bernie Sanders' labor platform, Elizabeth Warren's Bernie's Green New Deal platform, and Elizabeth Warren's both have very good ideas. Like, okay, we're going to close some coal mines. You know, coal mines are going to close. Coal-powered fire plants are going to close. And people are going to get laid off. So, you know, Bernie suggests paying them full wages for 5 years, providing them with training, providing them with full health benefits, providing, you know, making sure their pensions are still paid into. And ideas, proposals like that go very far to reassure unions. And in others, I was in Germany in the spring, and you know the Social Democratic Party there is really hurting. You know, and whereas the Green Party is doing very well, and people say the Social Democrats don't have enough ideas. And I think, you know, a lot of people on the left should really embrace the Green New Deal because it could mean, you know, trillions of dollars in spending on infrastructure. Many of them could be great middle-class union jobs. A lot of them require huge skills. There's this big push to build wind turbines that Governor Cuomo and environmentalists here and labor people in New York have really led the way on to create thousands of really good-paying jobs.
And Steve, in your book, you have a chapter on a revolution that most people don't pay much attention to, what's been happening in Nevada in recent years, and how Nevada has rapidly changed from a red state into a blue state, and largely as a result of the efforts of the culinary workers union in Nevada. Could you talk about that, especially in the context of the past of the labor movement, that it was always anti-immigrant for many, many decades until only recently, and how that's affected the growth of labor in Nevada?
Sure. So I have a section in the book about the unfortunate decline of unions and worker power, and how that has led to wage stagnation, increased inequality, and, you know, a horrible political system where the Koch brothers and billionaires and corporate donors dominate. And, you know, that's depressing and needs to be fixed. And then I have several chapters laying out various models about how to rebuild worker power. You know, the teacher strikes did a lot to show that workers could fight again. The Fight for 15 has in many ways been very successful. Then I also devote a chapter to the, you know, to my mind, what are the, you know, best, most impressive, most forward-looking, most, you know, aggressive unions in the United States. That's the Culinary Union in Las Vegas. They represent dishwashers and hotel housekeepers. And, you know, there's 60–70% immigrant workers. And while much of the labor movement has been shrinking in size, the Culinary Union has grown from 18,000 workers in the 1980s. It's more than tripled to 60,000 workers now. And it represents workers in the big hotel casinos. And, you know, nationwide, hotel housekeepers average $11 an hour. They often work just $25 a week, make less than $400 a week, make less than $20,000 a year. In Las Vegas, the hotel housekeepers earn, on average, $19.50 an hour. They're guaranteed 40-hour weeks. They make almost $800 a week, you know, $40,000 a year. I profile a hotel housekeeper, wonderful woman, Frances Garcia, an immigrant from Honduras. She alone is able, on her salary from the culinary as a housekeeper, is able to raise 3 kids. She has a very nice apartment, you know, big screen TV. You know, her kids are going to college. I mean, it shows that where there's a strong, enlightened union that involves the people, that is willing to engage in strikes, to make sure the employers pay their fair share, that, you know, these jobs that are often low wage elsewhere can be really good middle-class jobs with lots of respect. Now, on politics. So remember 2016, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania all flipped from blue to red, those supposedly blue, you know, blue wall states. Well, in Nevada, thanks largely to this amazing union, which really knows how to mobilize its members, Nevada has flipped from red to blue, and in the 2018 election, Nevada was the only state where an incumbent Republican senator lost his seat. So, you know, this is a union that pardon my French, is really kicking ass. It's really doing a very impressive job. And I devote a chapter to it because they're doing so many things that other unions, that other worker advocates should be doing. They're involving the members. They're mobilizing the members. They're willing to confront the employer. They're organizing. They do amazing organizing several thousand workers a year.
And in Nevada, Clinton beat Trump.
Yeah. And the crazy thing is Nevada's a right-to-work state. So, often unions are very reluctant to organize in right-to-work states because that means workers can't be required to pay union dues. Well, the culinary does such an amazing job helping its workers that over 95% of the people pay union dues, which is much higher than in most unions in right-to-work states.
You've referenced the teacher strikes, and we cannot say enough about the significance of these in the last year, and then also the upcoming Chicago teacher strike. If you can refer to what's happening here. This Chicago appears to be heading for a strike as the teachers union in the country's third largest district continue to negotiate after rejecting the district's latest offer. Teachers have been pushing for better pay, smaller class sizes, among other demands. In addition to teachers, workers in SEIU Local 73 say thousands of special ed, classroom assistants, bus aides, security officers, custodians could strike as early as October 17th. If the newly elected Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot continues in Rahm Emanuel's pro-austerity path. The last Chicago teacher strike 7 years ago.
So the Chicago Teachers Union has also been one of the leading lights in labor. And this strike in 2012 against Rahm Emanuel and his austerity policies was really a signal event in modern labor history. And it kind of encouraged years later the strikes in West Virginia, Oklahoma, Arizona that I write about in the book. And I have an op-ed in today's New York Times saying the teacher strikes and their success in ways embolden the GM workers. They feel that labor has wind on their back. At their backs, they saw that the teachers' strikes had huge public support because the public's concerned about wage stagnation, income inequality. So I think the GM workers are tapping into that sentiment. Now in Chicago, still, this very militant union, the Chicago Teachers Union, they're unhappy with continued austerity policies. I mean, I wouldn't love to be mayor of Chicago right now because it's a city with a big budget squeeze, and they're saying to the union, sorry, we can't spend as much as you like. And the union's saying there are all these gazillionaires in Chicago. You could certainly tax them more to help improve their schools. And it's another unhappy tug of war. Let's hope they reach a settlement without a strike.
I'm wondering if you comment in a few moments we have about the tensions that sometimes arise between the labor's direct interest for its members and the general societal issues. I'm talking about, for instance, SEIU for many years cozied up to Republicans and conservatives who were governors or political leaders as long as they supported card check for their members. And so you have this tension that sometimes arises between the need to service your members versus the general social goals of the labor movement.
So the SEIU, so we're in New York. So the SEIU agreed not to oppose Republican Governor George Pataki, so long as Pataki agreed to spend an extra $1 billion or $2 billion for Medicaid and health care in New York. And that was good for the union members, but also very, very good for a lot of New Yorkers who need health care. Now, some people say that was a selfish deal. The SEIU says that was good for us and that was good for New Yorkers at large. One of the really interesting developments now in labor is I think a lot of unions realized, hey, we're being perceived too often as narrow self-interest, just fighting for ourselves. And there's really this fast-growing movement called bargaining for the common good. And again, that was led by the Chicago Teachers Union and then West Virginia, Oklahoma, Arizona teachers, then Los Angeles teachers, that we're not fighting. Yeah, we've had a wage freeze for 2 years or 4 years, and yes, we want a raise, but we're not just fighting for that. In West Virginia, Arizona, Oklahoma, they saw that the Republican government was cutting taxes to the rich, cutting taxes on fracking, cutting taxes for corporations, while the education budgets were being starved, and there were pay freezes for teachers and not enough money for textbooks, and class sizes were getting larger. And they said, we're going on strike not just for us, but to help the community. And the strike this fall by the hotel workers at Marriott. They adopted a slogan that they thought would resonate with the public, and it really did. It said, "One job should be enough." I mean, it was crazy that all these workers were juggling 2 and 3 jobs. They were getting small raises while rents in San Francisco and Boston were soaring. So unions are really trying. Unions see that they're not as strong as they once were, and I explain this in detail. So they realize we have to reach out to community partners and and environmental partners and immigrant groups, and all together we could achieve a lot more than we can alone.
Stephen Greenhouse, please stay after. We'll do part 2 and ask you about your assessment of the presidential candidates' records on labor. Stephen Greenhouse, longtime journalist, covered labor for the New York Times for decades. He has a new book out, Beaten Down, Worked Up, The Past, Present, and Future of American Labor. This is Democracy Now! Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tammy Warrenoff, Libby Rainey, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Hani Masood, Tarina Nadura, Maria Studio, and Maria Terracina. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Thanks for joining us.